Everyone's heard of the Enigma machine, the German Cipher device, the one Alan Turing cracked, the one that gets all the documentaries, all the movies, all the credit. But here's what most people don't know. Enigma wasn't the only thing the Allies were trying to break. And Turing wasn't the only miracle, because somewhere between the chaos of a naval battle in the North Atlantic and the quiet desperation of men who knew they were losing the war at sea, a single codebook was pulled from a sinking German vessel. A waterlogged, bullet-riddled, almost destroyed piece of paper and binding that should never have made it to British hands. And when it didn't just unlock one German cipher. It rewrote the entire way the Allies thought about signals intelligence. Every cipher changed. Every decryption method adapted. Every intercept operation rebuilt from the ground up. That one captured Wehrmacht codebook didn't just help win a battle. It fundamentally altered the architecture of Allied intelligence for the rest of the war. And almost no one talks about it. If you want to understand what really happened in the shadows of World War II, stay right here. And if you find yourself fascinated by the stories they left out of the history books, hit subscribe right now, because this channel exists for exactly this. The stories that never made the final cut. The ones buried in declassified files, dusty archives, and the accounts of men who were sworn to silence for decades after the war ended. Let's start at the beginning. Not the dramatic beginning, with the firefight and the codebook getting hauled out of the ocean. Let's start with the problem. Because to understand why one codebook mattered so much, you have to understand what the Allies were up against. And the scale of it is staggering. By 1940, Germany had built one of the most sophisticated signals intelligence infrastructures in the history of warfare. They weren't just sending messages. They were layering them. They had multiple levels of encryption running simultaneously across different branches of the military. The Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, the Luftwaffe, the SS. Each had their own communication networks, their own cipher systems, their own protocols, and those networks were enormous. Thousands of messages every single day, bouncing between submarines in the Atlantic, command posts in North Africa, occupied territories across Europe, and the high command back in Berlin. The volume alone was overwhelming. The British government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park was essentially trying to drink from a fire hose. There were brilliant people there. Mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword puzzle addicts, chess grandmasters, and genuine cryptographic geniuses. But brilliance alone doesn't crack code. You need something to work with. You need cribs, patterns, repeated phrases, known message structures. And most critically, you need key material. The settings, the wheels, the plugboard connections, the indicator groups that tell you how a cipher machine was configured on any given day. Without that, even the most sophisticated mathematical attack on a cipher is like trying to open a combination lock by listening for clicks in a thunderstorm. Enigma, the famous one, had been partially broken by the Poles before the war even started. The Polish Cipher Bureau, specifically the work of Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosicki, and Henryk Zagalski, had done something remarkable in the 1930s. They reconstructed the internal wiring of the Enigma machine using nothing but pure mathematical analysis and intercepted traffic. They passed their work to the British and French in 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded Poland. That handoff essentially started the clock on Bletchley Park. But the Germans weren't standing still. They kept upgrading Enigma, adding plugboard connections, changing the number of rotors, switching daily key settings with increasing frequency and complexity. And the naval Enigma, the one used by the Kriegsmarine and specifically by the U-boat fleet, was particularly brutal to crack. The U-boats were what mattered most. By 1940 and into 1941, German submarines were devastating Allied shipping in the Atlantic at a rate that threatened to choke Britain into submission. Convoys were being tracked, intercepted, and destroyed with horrifying efficiency. And part of the reason those convoys kept getting found was that the U-boats were communicating in a cipher the Allies couldn't reliably read. Naval Enigma, particularly the version called Shark that the U-boat fleet switched to in 1942, used 4 rotors instead of 3. That single extra rotor didn't just make decryption slightly harder. It multiplied the number of possible settings by a factor so large that the bomb machines being used at Bletchley simply couldn't keep up, and people were dying because of it. Ships were going down, sailors were drowning, food and weapons and fuel that Britain desperately needed were sitting on the ocean floor. The cryptographers at Bletchley Park knew what the stakes were. Some of them had family members on those convoys. All of them knew that every day they couldn't read the U-boat traffic, more ships went down. The pressure was extraordinary. And it wasn't just about Enigma, because as good as Bletchley's Enigma work was during the periods they could read it, there was a whole other layer of German communications that the Allies were only beginning to scratch. Higher-level communications, the kind used by Wehrmacht High Command, by Gestapo headquarters, by senior military planners coordinating operations across entire theaters of war. These weren't going through Enigma machines in field positions. They were going through something more sophisticated. The Lorenz cipher, the fish traffic, the stuff that Bletchley's engineers and mathematicians were still trying to fully understand. And beneath all of it, there were auxiliary systems, codebooks, hand ciphers, supplementary materials used to authenticate messages, to establish session keys, to communicate fallback procedures when machine ciphers couldn't be used. Those codebooks were the glue holding the whole system together, and that's what makes what happened in the North Atlantic so explosive. The year is 1941. The month is May. The Battle of the Atlantic is at one of its most desperate points. British convoys are being hunted by wolf packs of German submarines operating with a coordination and efficiency that is frankly terrifying. The Kriegsmarine has developed a system where a U-boat that spots a convoy doesn't attack immediately. It shadows the target, radios its position to headquarters in France, and waits while other submarines converge. Then they attack together. It's tactically brilliant, and it's made possible almost entirely by radio communication. All those signals, all that coordination, all those position reports and attack instructions are encrypted, and the Allies are reading some of it when they can, when the daily Enigma settings allow, when the code breakers at Bletchley have enough crib material to work with. But the gaps are killing them, literally. Into this situation comes HMS Bulldog, a British destroyer operating in the North Atlantic as part of a convoy escort group. On the morning of May 9, 1941, the escort group detects a German U-boat that has been shadowing convoy OB-318. The U-boat is U-1110, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp. The name Lemp is already infamous by this point. He commanded U-30 at the start of the war, and on the very first day of hostilities, he sank the passenger liner SS Athenia, killing 112 civilians. That attack was technically a violation of German rules of engagement, and it caused a diplomatic crisis. Lemp claimed he thought Athenia was an armed merchant cruiser. Whether that was true or not, his name was already associated with catastrophic mistakes. On May 9, 1941, he made another one. His boat was running submerged near the convoy when it was detected by HMS Aubretia, a convoy escort. Depth charges brought U-110 to the surface, damaged and unable to dive again. The crew began abandoning ship, and Lemp, according to post-war German accounts, attempted to swim back to the boat to ensure the destruction of sensitive materials on board. He never made it. He drowned. Whether he was shot by British sailors or simply disappeared in the chaos of the ocean is disputed to this day. But what matters is what happened next. The captain of HMS Bulldog, Commander Joe Baker Cresswell, made a decision in those frantic minutes that would echo through the rest of the war. Instead of immediately sinking the stricken submarine, he ordered a boarding party. He could see that U-110 was still afloat, and he suspected there might be something worth recovering on board. He was right beyond anything he could have imagined. The boarding party, led by Sub-Lieutenant David Balme, reached U-110 and went below. What they found was extraordinary. The boat hadn't been scuttled, the crew had evacuated so quickly, and Lemp had been unable to complete the destruction order, that the interior was essentially intact. There were documents everywhere, navigation charts, signal logs, operating manuals. And sitting at the wireless operator station, untouched, still set to the day's operating position, was an Enigma machine complete with its current rotor settings. But that's the part you already know, or might know, because the capture of Enigma material from U-110 has been documented before. What gets less attention, what gets glossed over in the popular accounts, is what else came out of that boat, the supplementary material, the supporting documents, the thing that took Bletchley Park from working with a brilliant puzzle to having a map. Among the materials recovered from U-110 were the current Kriegsmarine cipher keys, specifically the short signal codebook and the weather short signal book. These were the auxiliary documents that U-boats used alongside Enigma. The weather codebook in particular was critical, because every morning, U-boats transmitted weather reports back to headquarters using a standardized format encoded through Enigma. Codebreakers at Bletchley had known for a long time that those weather messages existed and that they followed a predictable structure. But knowing a message probably starts with weather data, and being able to use that knowledge to crack the day's Enigma settings are two very different things. With the actual codebook in hand, suddenly those weather messages became perfect cribs. Every single morning, U-boats were handing Bletchley Park the key to unlock that day's naval Enigma settings. The impact was immediate. Within weeks of the U-110 capture, British ability to read naval Enigma traffic improved dramatically. Convoy routing became more effective. Ships that would have sailed directly into waiting wolf packs were diverted. The tonnage losses that had been climbing toward catastrophic levels began, slowly, painfully, to come down. And more than that, having the actual cipher materials in hand told the cryptographers at Bletchley something fundamental about how the Germans were structuring their communication security. Where the gaps were, what procedures they were using for key changes, how the supplementary hand cipher systems interacted with the machine ciphers. That knowledge was invaluable not just for attacking naval Enigma, but for every other German communication system the Allies were trying to penetrate. Because the Germans applied similar security philosophies across different branches of their military. The Wehrmacht on land used analogous procedures. The Luftwaffe used related systems. Understanding the structure of one gave you insights into the structure of all of them. The U-110 materials were shared under absolute secrecy. The German prisoners taken from the boat were isolated and given no indication that their codebooks had been captured. Baker Cresswell was warned in the most serious terms possible that if the Germans ever found out what had been taken, they would change everything immediately and the intelligence advantage would be gone. The secrecy held. U-110 itself was eventually sunk to prevent German aerial reconnaissance from spotting it and raising suspicions. The official story was that the submarine had been sunk by depth charges during the engagement. For decades, the full story of what was recovered was classified. The men who boarded that boat were sworn to silence. David Balme, who led the boarding party and personally carried the Enigma machine and the codebooks to the surface, didn't speak publicly about what he'd done for over 30 years. When he finally did, the historical world got a clearer picture of just how consequential that single moment in the North Atlantic had been. But here's where the story gets deeper and more complicated. Because U-110 wasn't the only source. And the impact of what was recovered didn't flow in just one direction. To understand the full scope of how captured German cipher material changed Allied intelligence, you have to look at the broader capture program that developed around it. Before U-110, there had already been earlier captures of German cipher material. In February 1940, HMS Gleaner sank U-33 in the Firth of Clyde, and a rating named Karl Schacht was found, with Enigma rotors stuffed in his pockets when he was pulled out of the water. He'd apparently forgotten to throw them overboard, or perhaps hadn't had time. Those rotors were recovered and sent to Bletchley, where they revealed the internal wiring of two rotors not previously known. Then in April 1940, during the Norwegian campaign, a German armed trawler named Polaris was captured, and it was carrying the Enigma keys for the month. That gave Bletchley their first real taste of how much could be learned from physical capture of material. It whetted their appetite enormously. After U-110, the understanding that physical capture could be more valuable than almost any amount of mathematical cryptanalysis led to a deliberate policy. The Admiralty began planning what became known as pinch operations, specifically designed raids to capture German cipher material from ships, weather stations, and shore installations. These weren't opportunistic. They were calculated, intelligence-driven operations with the explicit goal of getting documents out of German hands before they could be destroyed. One of the most significant early pinch operations targeted the German weather trawlers operating in the North Atlantic and Arctic. These vessels were a necessity for the Kriegsmarine because accurate weather data was essential for U-boat operations and for planning surface fleet movements. But collecting that weather data required ships at sea for extended periods, and those ships were equipped with Enigma machines and current key lists to communicate back to headquarters. In May 1941, the same month as the U-110 capture, British forces raided the weather trawler Munich in the North Atlantic. They captured Enigma settings for June 1941, the current short signal books, and crucially, the officer's cipher, a hand cipher system used by German naval officers for a certain class of message that didn't go through Enigma at all. In September 1941, another trawler, Gdania, was captured along with the weather ship Lauenburg, yielding the Enigma keys for July 1941. Each of these captures fed directly into Bletchley's ability to maintain continuous reading of naval Enigma traffic. But what was accumulating was more than just key material. It was a comprehensive picture of German communication doctrine, the procedures, the discipline, the assumptions the Germans were making about their own security. And that picture had implications far beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. Here's the thing that doesn't get discussed enough. The Allies weren't just using captured German material to read German messages. They were using it to build their own cipher systems. To understand this, you have to think about what Allied signals security looked like in the early years of the war. It wasn't good. Britain had its own cipher machines, its own code books, its own procedures. But they were built on pre-war assumptions about the sophistication of enemy signals intelligence, and those assumptions were dangerously wrong. The Germans had their own highly capable signals intelligence operation. The OKW/CHI, the Wehrmacht Signals Intelligence Service, had been reading certain Allied communications with troubling regularity. American diplomatic codes in particular had been badly compromised before and during the early war years. The so-called Black Code used by the United States military attaché in Cairo was being read by Italian intelligence and then shared with German forces under Rommel. That's why Rommel seemed to know in advance what the British were planning in North Africa. He was reading their mail. Literally, when the extent of Allied communications vulnerabilities became clear, partly through the captured German material that revealed how German signals intelligence was structured and what they were targeting, it triggered a fundamental reevaluation of Allied cipher security. The methodologies that German cryptanalysts were using against Allied systems, the mathematical attacks, the exploitation of operator errors, the use of known plaintext, all of it was suddenly visible to Allied planners in a new way, because they were seeing the same methodologies in reverse. Every time Allied cryptanalysts used a technique to break a German cipher, they were also cataloging a vulnerability in their own systems, and the captured Wehrmacht codebook from U-110 and subsequent pinch operations provided an enormous amount of raw material for that analysis. What changed first was the British naval cipher systems. After examining German cipher materials closely, British cryptographers at Bletchley and at the Naval Intelligence Division identified several characteristics of their own codes that were vulnerable to the same types of attacks the Germans used. The naval cipher number 3, which was used for convoy coordination between British and American forces, was particularly problematic. It was a codebook-based system that was being used far too frequently for far too much traffic. Volume of traffic is an enemy of cipher security. The more messages you send in a given system, the more material an adversary has to work with. By 1941 and into 1942, the Germans were in fact reading British naval cipher number 3 through their own B-Dienst Signals Intelligence Service. This created a nightmarish situation where each side was partially reading the other's communications. Convoys were being routed based on intelligence about U-boat positions derived from Enigma decrypts, while those same convoys were being tracked by the Germans through their decrypts of British cipher traffic. It was like two chess players who could each occasionally see some of the other's pieces. The strategic impact depended on who saw more at any given moment. Understanding this through the captured German material accelerated the British decision to retire naval cipher number 3 and replace it with a more secure system. That change happened in June 1943. And it contributed significantly to the turn of the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic later that year. But the reconfiguration of Allied cipher systems wasn't limited to the British Navy. It cascaded outward, because as the war expanded and Allied operations became more complex, the need to share intelligence securely between different nations and different services became critical. The Americans had entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The relationship between British and American signals intelligence was extraordinarily close, arguably the most intimate intelligence-sharing relationship in history at that point, and the Americans were eager to incorporate the lessons of what Bletchley had learned. General Dwight Eisenhower, preparing for operations in North Africa and eventually Europe, needed to receive and act on ultra-intelligence, the decrypts derived from broken Enigma and Lorenz traffic, without that system being compromised. The procedures for distributing ultra to field commanders, the cover stories used to explain how intelligence had been gathered without revealing it, came from communications intercepts, the handling protocols that prevented German agents from noticing that the Allies seemed inexplicably well-informed. All of those procedures were shaped by the understanding gained from captured German material. Because captured German documents included, in some cases, examples of German analysis of Allied behavior. Cases where German intelligence had become suspicious that their communications might be compromised because Allied forces had responded too quickly or too accurately to information that should have been secret. Studying those German suspicions told the Allied planners exactly what kind of behavior might betray the ultra-secret, and they adjusted accordingly. There's another dimension to this that operates at an entirely different level. The capture of German cipher material didn't just improve Allied ability to read German traffic or improve Allied cipher security. It fundamentally changed the theoretical understanding of cryptography that Allied systems were built on. Before the war, cipher security was understood primarily in terms of brute force mathematics. A cipher was considered secure if the number of possible keys was large enough that an adversary couldn't try them all. Enigma had an enormous number of possible settings, something like 150 million, and the Germans believed that made it unbreakable. What they missed, and what the capture of actual cipher materials drove home to Allied cryptographers, was that mathematical security and operational security are completely different problems. A cipher can be mathematically perfect and still be broken if the people using it make procedural mistakes, if they reuse key settings, if they send messages with predictable formats, if they use the same phrases at the same times every day, if the physical materials that implement the cipher, the code books, the key lists, the rotor settings, can be captured. The Germans had world-class mathematicians working on their cipher design, but their operational security was riddled with mistakes. They sent stereotyped messages with predictable opening phrases. They had operators who made consistent errors that created exploitable patterns. They trusted the mathematical security of Enigma so completely that they didn't adequately secure the physical materials that made it work. Every one of those vulnerabilities was visible in the captured materials recovered from U-110 and subsequent operations, and every one of them became a lesson that Allied cipher designers applied to their own systems. The British Typex machine, which was Britain's version of Enigma, was substantially more secure in its operational procedures, partly because British cipher operators were trained to avoid the exact mistakes their German counterparts were making. American cipher systems, particularly the Cipher machine, were designed with an understanding of how Enigma had been broken and specifically engineered to eliminate the vulnerabilities that had made those attacks possible. Cipher is remarkable in that it was never broken during the war. Not by Germany, not by Japan. The theoretical and practical understanding derived from captured German material was a significant factor in why Allied cipher machines proved so much more resistant to cryptanalytic attack than German ciphers were. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention: the role of captured codebooks in what was happening on the Eastern Front. Because while the Battle of the Atlantic and the intelligence war in Western Europe get the most coverage, the Germans and Soviets were running their own parallel signals intelligence struggle, and Allied material, including information about captured Wehrmacht cipher documents, was flowing through some extraordinary channels. The Soviet Union had its own highly capable signals intelligence service, the SIGINT components of what would eventually become the GRU, and later supported by the NKVD. Soviet cryptanalysts had been working on German communications since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. They were making some progress, particularly against lower-level hand ciphers and field radio traffic, but the higher-level stuff, the Enigma traffic from Wehrmacht headquarters and Army group communications, was beyond their capabilities. The British and Americans had a complex relationship with Soviet intelligence sharing. Churchill was deeply ambivalent about it. He was receiving ultra-intelligence that was tactically relevant to the Eastern Front, information about German intentions and dispositions that could have saved Soviet lives, and he was sharing very little of it directly, partly because he was terrified of compromising the ultra-secret. If Soviet security was penetrated, if a German agent inside Soviet intelligence found out the Allies were reading Enigma, the Germans would change their systems, and the advantage would be gone. There was also, frankly, the political calculation about post-war competition with the Soviet Union. But some information did flow. Through the Lucy spy ring, a Swiss-based intelligence network that passed remarkably accurate information about German military plans to Moscow, information that historians now believe included some material derived from ultra-decrypts. The exact mechanism is still debated by historians. But the point is this: the strategic intelligence advantage that the Allies had built through their exploitation of captured German cipher material was shaping the war in multiple theaters simultaneously, including theaters where the direct British and American military presence was minimal. The Soviet victories at Kursk in 1943 and the subsequent grinding advance back through Ukraine and into Germany itself were supported by an intelligence picture that included, at least partially, information flowing from Western ultra sources. And that picture was made possible by the work done at Bletchley, which was built on a foundation of captured material. Let's pull back to the specific story of how the captured Wehrmacht codebooks changed Allied cipher practice in a more granular, operational sense. Because it wasn't just about the big strategic systems. It was about the thousands of smaller decisions made every day in the field, at sea, and in the air. One of the most critical things recovered from U-110 and related captures was insight into the German short signal system, the Kurzsignale. This was a procedure for compressing routine operational messages, position reports, sighting reports, weather data, into extremely short-coded groups that could be transmitted in just a few seconds. The reason for this was practical. A U-boat transmitting on radio could be located by enemy direction-finding equipment. The longer you transmitted, the better the chance of being found. So the Kriegsmarine developed elaborate procedures for abbreviating messages into the shortest possible form. When Allied signals intelligence analysts examined the captured Kurzsignal materials, they understood something important. These short messages were transmitted in patterns that could be identified even without decrypting them. The timing, the frequency, the relative position of direction-finding fixes, all of it created a picture of where U-boats were operating even when the content of their messages couldn't be read. This contributed to the development of what became known as HF/DF, or HUF-DUF, high-frequency direction finding. Allied convoy escorts equipped with these direction-finding sets could detect a U-boat's transmission, determine its bearing, and use that information to vector other escorts toward it. You didn't need to decrypt the message to use it as a location signal. The capture of the short signal codebooks made it possible to understand and exploit this vulnerability in German communication doctrine, precisely because the captured documents explained in detail how and when the short signals were supposed to be transmitted. Understanding the doctrine meant you could predict the behavior and exploit it tactically. By 1943, HF/DF equipment on escort ships was a major contributor to Allied success against U-boats. When a submarine surfaced to transmit its position report, it was potentially signing its own death warrant. Commanders knew this. Some tried to minimize transmissions, but the operational requirements of coordinating wolfpack attacks meant they couldn't go completely silent, and every time they transmitted, Allied direction finders were listening. That tactical evolution traces a direct line back to the technical understanding derived from captured cipher materials. There's a character in this story who deserves more recognition than he typically gets. Ian Fleming. Yes, that Ian Fleming, the future creator of James Bond. In 1939, before the war had really started, Fleming was serving as a personal assistant to the Director of Naval Intelligence, Admiral John Godfrey. And in September 1939, Fleming drafted what became known as Operation Ruthless. It was a proposal, a plan to capture a German naval codebook. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. The idea was to crash a captured German aircraft in the Channel near a German vessel, disguise a team of British naval officers in German uniforms, wait for the German ship to come to render aid, then overpower the German crew, steal their cipher materials, and sink the ship to prevent discovery. It was, to put it charitably, an extremely aggressive plan. It was never executed. The circumstances never lined up correctly, and there were serious concerns about the legality of the operation under international law, since it involved personnel in enemy uniforms. But the fact that it was seriously proposed, that the Director of Naval Intelligence's personal assistant was spending his time designing schemes to capture codebooks, tells you everything about how desperately the British needed physical access to German cipher materials in those early months of the war. When U-110 was captured without any such elaborate scheme, simply through the determined action of Commander Baker Cresswell's boarding party, it must have seemed almost miraculous. And Fleming himself, it has been suggested, drew on his knowledge of naval intelligence operations, including the cipher capture programs, when he later created his fictional spy. The emphasis on physical intelligence work, on stealing documents, on the material reality of espionage rather than purely technical approaches, runs through the Bond novels in ways that reflect Fleming's actual experiences. But that's a story for another time. The point here is that the desperation to capture physical cipher materials was recognized at the highest levels of British naval intelligence from almost the first days of the war, and the programs that pursued that goal were among the most consequential of the entire conflict. By 1942, the exploitation of captured German cipher materials had become systematized. There was a dedicated unit at Bletchley Park, working in coordination with naval intelligence and military intelligence, whose job was specifically to analyze captured German signal documents and extract every possible piece of useful information from them. They weren't just looking for key settings, they were mapping the entire structure of German communications security. Which units used which systems, what the reporting relationships were, how changes in cipher settings were distributed, what the fallback procedures were when primary systems failed, what codes were used for what types of message. This organizational map of German communications was itself a form of intelligence that had value independent of any individual message. Because if you know how a system is structured, you can sometimes predict where it's going to be vulnerable before you've seen any actual traffic. The captured codebooks were essential to building this map. They contained not just cipher material but procedural instructions, explanations of when to use which system, how to authenticate messages, what to do when a cipher machine was unavailable. Those procedural documents were gold. They told Allied analysts how German communications personnel were trained and what habits they were expected to form. And habits, as any cryptanalyst will tell you, are the enemy of security. Predictable behavior creates exploitable patterns. Knowing what behavior German operators had been trained toward gave Allied analysts a head start on finding those patterns. The results of this systematic approach extended in some surprising directions. One example is what happened with the analysis of German meteorological communications. Weather reporting was a necessity for all branches of the German military, and it was done with a combination of machine cipher and hand codes depending on the circumstances. The captured weather short signal book from U-110 opened up not just naval weather messages, but eventually contributed to understanding parallel weather reporting systems used by the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Weather data was shared across German military branches. Cracking the procedures for one branch gave insights into the others. By the time the Allies were planning the D-Day landings in Normandy, their meteorological intelligence was far superior to what the Germans could access, partly because they were reading German weather reports along with their own direct observations. Eisenhower's decision to launch on June 6, 1944, in a narrow, favorable weather window that the Germans didn't know was coming, was made with confidence, partly because Allied meteorologists had a more complete picture of the weather patterns over the English Channel than their counterparts in German headquarters did. That window of superior weather intelligence was built, in part, on the foundation of captured codebooks and cipher materials. The story doesn't end in 1941 with U-110. The pinch operations continued and evolved throughout the war, and each significant capture built on the last. In October 1942, Operation Reservist, a British commando raid on Iran in North Africa, had the secondary objective of capturing French naval cipher material. The political situation with Vichy France meant that French naval codes were potentially useful for understanding Axis communications in the Mediterranean theater. The raid was only partially successful militarily, but it generated useful intelligence about communication procedures in that theater. In November 1942, around the same time as Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, British forces captured a substantial amount of German and Italian signal equipment and documentation in Libya as Rommel's forces retreated. The material included Wehrmacht field cipher systems and the associated key documents. This was exactly the kind of material that gave Bletchley Park insights into how the Wehrmacht's communication procedures worked on the ground in an active theater of operations. It was one thing to understand the theoretical structure of German military ciphers. It was another to see the actual documents that real soldiers were using in actual combat conditions, with all the improvisation and corner-cutting that operational pressure produces. Those captured field documents revealed something important. Under combat conditions, German cipher discipline often broke down. Messages were sent in outdated key settings because new settings hadn't arrived. Improper encryption procedures were used because there wasn't time to follow protocols correctly. Operator errors multiplied under stress. These operational vulnerabilities were different from, and in some ways more significant than the mathematical vulnerabilities in the cipher designs themselves. Understanding them allowed Allied signals intelligence to concentrate analytical resources at exactly the times when German cipher security was likely to be at its weakest. During intense combat operations, during rapid advances or retreats, during periods of administrative disruption, German signals discipline degraded. Allied analysts learned to look for those periods and exploit them aggressively. This understanding was directly informed by captured field documents that showed what happened to cipher procedures when soldiers were under fire and exhausted and trying to coordinate complex tactical movements. Let's talk about the fish traffic now, because if Enigma is the famous story, the Lorenz cipher and the work done to break it represents perhaps the greatest cryptanalytic achievement of the entire war. And captured Wehrmacht material played a crucial role there too. The Lorenz SC-40 and SC-42, called Fish by the British, and specifically the Tunny version by Bletchley's analysts, was a teleprinter cipher used for the highest-level Wehrmacht communications. Hitler's orders to his field commanders. Strategic planning between OKW and Army Group headquarters. The kind of traffic that contained the innermost thoughts of German military leadership. Enigma was used for tactical and operational messages. Lorenz was where the strategic conversations happened. Breaking Lorenz required a completely different approach from breaking Enigma. You couldn't use bomb machines. The cipher was far more complex, based on a different mathematical structure involving the XOR combination of the message with a pseudo-random key stream generated by 12 cipher wheels. In 1941, German operators made a catastrophic mistake. Two operators sent the same message twice, with the same Lorenz key settings, one after the other, because one of them hadn't received the first transmission properly. This gave British mathematician Bill Toot enough material to reconstruct the entire logical structure of the Lorenz machine from the intercepted traffic alone, without ever seeing the actual hardware. It was one of the most brilliant pieces of pure cryptanalysis in history. But here's where captured material matters. Understanding the structure of the Lorenz machine through Toot's analysis was one thing. Efficiently breaking each day's traffic required knowing procedural details, the way settings were chosen and distributed, the message indicator systems, the authentication procedures. Those details couldn't be derived from ciphertext analysis alone. They came from captured documents, including material recovered from German signals units and from sites overrun as Allied forces advanced. Each piece of captured procedural documentation shortened the time it took to break into a day's Lorenz traffic. And time was everything. The Colossus computers built at Bletchley, specifically to attack Lorenz traffic, were among the first electronic computers in history. They were built to attack a specific set of cipher wheel patterns, and having accurate procedural information about how those wheels were set up made the Colossus attacks far more targeted and efficient. The intelligence derived from Lorenz traffic, the actual strategic plans and orders of the German High Command, was some of the most valuable intelligence of the entire war. It told Churchill and Eisenhower not just what German forces were doing, but what Hitler was thinking, how he was responding to Allied operations, where he believed the threats were greatest, what reserves he was holding and where. That intelligence shaped Allied strategy at the highest levels, and the ability to read it rested on a combination of brilliant mathematical work and the accumulated procedural intelligence derived from captured German communications materials. By 1943, the cumulative effect of all these captures, all this analysis, all this adaptation, was becoming visible at the strategic level. The Battle of the Atlantic reached its turning point in May 1943. In that single month, the Kriegsmarine lost 43 U-boats. The losses were so severe that Admiral Dönitz temporarily withdrew the U-boats from the North Atlantic entirely. This was a catastrophic strategic defeat for Germany. The ability to sustain Britain with supplies and to build up the forces necessary for the eventual invasion of Europe depended on controlling the Atlantic sea lanes. When the U-boats were beaten back, that lifeline was secured. The turning point was the result of multiple factors working together: new Allied weapons and tactics, more aircraft for convoy escort, including long-range liberators that closed the mid-Atlantic gap, where submarines had previously been able to operate beyond air cover, new radar systems, including the centimetric radar that submarines couldn't detect with their existing warning equipment, HF/DF direction finding, improved depth charges and hedgehog ahead-throwing weapons, more and better trained escort vessels, and intelligence. Better intelligence than any navy in history had ever possessed about the dispositions and intentions of an enemy force. The Enigma decrypts that Bletchley was providing, when they were current, allowed convoy routing that avoided waiting wolf packs. When the decrypts were unavailable or stale, HF/DF could sometimes fill the gap. The combination of technical superiority, tactical innovation, and intelligence advantage was overwhelming. But strip away the intelligence advantage and the tactical picture changes dramatically. And that intelligence advantage was built, piece by piece, on a foundation that included the materials recovered from U-110 on May 9, 1941. The boarding party that pulled those documents out of a sinking submarine in the North Atlantic changed the arithmetic of the Battle of the Atlantic. Not immediately, not in a single dramatic moment, but steadily, cumulatively, in ways that compounded over 2 years of sustained effort. There's a final dimension to this story that's worth exploring at length, because it extends beyond the war itself. The experience of building and running the Allied signals intelligence operation, including the capture and exploitation of German cipher materials, created a template for how signals intelligence would be conducted in the second half of the 20th century and beyond. The organizations, the methodologies, the relationships that were built during the war formed the foundation of what became the modern Western intelligence community. The partnership between British and American signals intelligence that was formalized during the war eventually became the UKUSA Agreement of 1946 and the broader Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance that still exists today. The foundational principles of that alliance, the idea of sharing raw signals intelligence, the protocols for protecting sources, the procedures for distributing decrypted material only to those with a need to know, all of those were worked out during the war, partly in response to the lessons learned from capturing and exploiting German cipher materials. The people who went through Bletchley Park, the mathematicians, the engineers, the linguists, the analysts, they came out of the war with a deep practical understanding of how signals intelligence actually worked. Many of them went on to shape post-war intelligence institutions. The Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, the direct descendant of the Government Code and Cipher School. The National Security Agency in the United States, which absorbed the Army and Navy signals intelligence organizations after the war. These institutions were built by people who had spent years breaking enemy codes and defending against enemy code breakers. The lessons they'd learned were embedded in the design of those institutions. And the single most important lesson, the one that ran through every major intelligence success of the war, was that theoretical security means nothing without operational security. A mathematically perfect cipher broken by sloppy procedures, a secure system compromised by physical capture of key materials. A brilliant defense undone by an improperly trained operator making a predictable mistake. That lesson was learned in the most brutal possible classroom, a global war where the price of failure was paid in ships sunk and soldiers killed. The people who learned it didn't forget it. They built institutions specifically designed to embody it. Every security protocol at GCHQ and NSA, every procedure for handling classified cipher materials, every training program for signals intelligence personnel, these carry the DNA of lessons learned, partly from the capture of German codebooks in the North Atlantic and the subsequent years of intensive exploitation. Now let's go back to the specific moment and linger in it, because it deserves to be seen clearly. May 9th, 1941, HMS Bulldog in the North Atlantic. The sea is cold and gray. U-110 is damaged on the surface, her crew abandoning ship. Commander Baker Cresswell orders the boarding